Okay, we want to continue our discussion of nerve pathways with a little bit more in-depth analysis of the withdrawal reflex, whose function is to remove a body limb or other part from a painful stimulus, and it involves reciprocal innervation, where um, we simultaneously cause the relaxation of extensor muscles while the flexor muscle contracts, and this removes the limb from the painful stimulus. It's also involved in the stretch reflex. The crossed extensor reflex is when a withdrawal reflex is initiated in one upper limb. The crossed extensor reflex causes the extension of the opposite lower limb. As an example, if you were walking on the beach and you were in your bare feet and you stepped on a piece of glass with your right leg, the right leg would go up, the left leg would go bolt straight in an effort to retain your balance, and you would, as a result, remove yourself from the painful stimulus. So we see two reflexes going on at the same time, right? You've got the withdrawal reflex from the painful stimulus, and then you've got this extensor reflex, which is helping you maintain your balance. And this is obviously going to involve um, some nerve pathways that are both ipsilateral and contralateral, meaning they're going to innervate areas on the opposite and on the same side as the stimulus. So if we look at the withdrawal reflex, what we see is the initial stimulus being pain receptors that detect the painful stimulus. The sensory neurons conduct action potentials to the spinal cord. They synapse with excitatory neurons that synapse with alpha motor neurons. The excitation of these neurons results in contraction of flexor muscles, and we withdraw the limb from the painful stimulus. So what happens in this case is that the knee will bend, okay, which involves the relaxation of the quadriceps and the flexing of the hamstrings, and as a result, we now are free of the painful stimulus. Okay, so there's our withdrawal reflex, and you can see the pathway here. This is the sensory input, is the afferent information coming in through the dorsal root ganglion, in through the dorsal root and into the dorsal horn. We synapse directly onto the interneuron, which hits the alpha motor neuron, and then this is going to innervate the targeted muscle group, the hamstring group, and the knee will bend. Okay, so that's relatively straightforward. But then if we sort of extend this a little bit further, what we have to understand is that sometimes it's not enough simply um, to flex the hamstrings in order to bend the knee. We have to at the same time inhibit the contraction of the quadriceps. Otherwise, you're not going to remove the limb from the painful stimulus. So during the withdrawal reflex, sensory neurons conduct action potentials from pain receptors to the spinal cord. They synapse with the excitatory interneurons that are part of the withdrawal reflex, and collateral branches of these neurons synapse with inhibitory neurons that are part of the reciprocal innervation. These inhibitory interneurons synapse with alpha motor neurons supplying the extensor muscles and cause them to relax and not oppose the flexor muscle withdrawal reflex, and so the contraction can take place. So what we're saying at the same time that we're telling the hamstrings to contract is we're telling the quadriceps to relax. Okay, so that's the reciprocal innervation. And we can see here again how the pathway operates, right? We're building brick by brick here. Here comes the painful stimulus in through the dorsal root ganglion, through the dorsal root. We synapse onto the alpha motor neuron, which is going to innervate the hamstrings and the knee will bend, but at the same time, at the same pretty much level of the spinal cord, we're also going to have synapsing onto an alpha motor neuron, which will cause the alpha motor neuron that would normally innervate contraction of the quadriceps muscle to fail to fire. Okay, so we're cutting off innervation to this muscle group at the same time that we're producing innervation to this muscle group. If both muscle groups contracted at the same time, the net effect would be virtually no movement. Okay, so that's our reciprocal innervation. Notice again that the white matter of the central nervous system is responsible for signal transmission, while the gray matter is doing the signal processing. You can see that here with the action of the interneurons and the production of a graded potential in the soma and the dendrites of the alpha motor neuron on which it synapses. The same thing is true with the interneuron, right? Um, it's being signaled by the incoming sensory neuron. Again, these graded potentials are being created on the dendrites in the soma, and that's producing now an action potential that's going to uh, reciprocally innervate. We're going to simultaneously cause the hamstrings to contract, and a separate interneuron receiving this innervation will also cause the quadriceps to relax, okay, simply inhibit the firing. So you could imagine that the stimulus between this interneuron and this alpha motor neuron is going to be depolarizing, whereas the innervation here is going to be hyperpolarizing, so make it less likely to fire. Now, if we carry this one step further, let's say that we're using the example of walking on the beach. At the same time, we step on a piece of glass in our bare feet. Up goes the leg, out goes the opposite leg, and we're hopping around in pain as we hold the foot. So during the withdrawal reflex, remember that the sensory neurons are going to bring the pain information in through the dorsal root of the spinal cord and synapse with excitatory interneurons that are going to be part of the withdrawal reflex. They're going to stimulate alpha motor neurons that'll innervate flexor muscles, causing the withdrawal of the limb from the painful stimulus, while at the same time cutting off the innervation of the extensor muscles. Okay, that's our reciprocal innervation. And then collateral branches of the sensory neurons um, are going to um, initiate what we call the crossed extensor reflex. So what they'll do is they'll cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord as part of this crossed extensor reflex. The excitatory interneurons are going to stimulate alpha motor neurons on the contralateral side that supply extensor muscles in the opposite limb, and this will cause the knee to straighten, and this will support the body weight during the withdrawal reflex. And so you can see here again how all this works. So we've got the painful stimulus coming in via the dorsal root ganglion and dorsal root. We have synapsing onto interneurons, which are going to, number one, cause the hamstrings to contract, and at the same time, a second set will cause the quadriceps to fail to contract. Okay, so they will not be innervated; they'll be inhibited. And then we're going to cross to the opposite side of the body again at the level of the spinal cord, and we're going to innervate the quadriceps muscles. They'll contract, the leg will straighten, and we will withdraw from the painful stimulus. Now, sensory information is also going to go to the brain, but it kind of gets there after the fact. And it's important for the brain to be aware of it, but it's not absolutely necessary for the brain to operate for the reflex to execute. In fact, they've shown in animal models that you can cut off information going to the brain and the reflexes will still respond. Descending tracts from the brain carry information to the reflexes, and neurotransmitters are going to produce either excitatory or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, which will modify the reflex. So you can see here, here we have the stimulus, right? Here's the incoming information via the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal root. We have synapsis onto an interneuron. Outgoing information through the ventral root is going to innervate the muscle, and the response to the stimulus will be executed. At the same time, we're going to have um, branching of these um, dorsal root neurons that is going to synapse and send information via ascending tracts up to the brain. Again, notice that this is in the white matter of the spinal cord near the periphery, and then at the same time, information will come down from the brain via descending tracts which can modify the reflex after it's been executed. But again, the brain really is the last part of the nervous system to know about the response to the stimulus. The reflex executes really before the brain gets involved to a great extent. Now, spinal nerves consist of axon bundles, Schwann cells, and connective tissue. And the connective tissue is arranged very similar to the way it's arranged in muscle tissue. We have an endoneurium that surrounds individual neurons and a perineurium that surrounds bundles of axons that form fascicles, and then an epineurium that is going to surround the entire nerve. Okay, so as we move from the inside out, you can see that the arrangement is very similar. The function is very similar too. The connective tissue serves a supportive function, but it also has an insulating function. It allows neurons to carry information to and from the central nervous system without a lot of crosstalk, in part due to the myelination of the axons of a lot of these neurons. But in addition to that, the connective tissue has an insulating function as well as a supportive one. Now, if we look at the spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and this is part of the evidence indicating that the spinal cord is a segmented structure. We know this if we look really at the human body and notice repeating patterns in certain body segments. For instance, we see repeating patterns in the vertebral column. We see repeating patterns in the spinal cord. We see repeating patterns in the rib cage, just to name a few examples. So segmentation is something that allows a more complex body plan to develop, and it's one of the developmental aspects of evolution that really didn't show up until relatively late. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The first pair exit the vertebral column between the skull and the atlas, and the last four pair exit the sacral foramina. Others exit through the intervertebral foramina, the holes that are produced by two vertebrae, one on top of the other, and there's an opening between them that is posterior to the body and anterior to the spinous processes of both vertebrae. 8 pair of cervical, 12 pair of thoracic, and 5 pair of lumbar, as well as 5 pair of sacral and 1 pair of coccygeal spinal nerves make up the entire set. Now, the cranial nerves, as we're going to discover, numbered 1 through 12, go to specific sensory organs primarily located in the head, with a few exceptions, among them being the spinal accessory nerve and the vagus nerve. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves tend to innervate structures that are near where they exit the spinal cord in terms of you could call it a vertical orientation. If we look at the dermatomal map, what we see is that spinal nerves are indicated by the capital letter and the number. So we've got cervical, a thoracic, and a lumbar division, as well as a sacral and a coccygeal division. The dermatomal map is the skin area that's supplied with sensory innervation by spinal nerves. And what we find with these dermatomes is that they are generally served by overlapping clusters of nerve roots. And so when we go in for anesthesia, all right, in preparation for surgery, one of the things that the anesthesiologist has to do is to numb or treat consecutive clusters of spinal nerves so that entire dermatomes are cut off from sending a painful stimulus back to the central nervous system. If this doesn't happen, obviously during surgery, we'll experience pain and we may come out of the anesthesia. And you can see the dermatomal map here, the cervical division in blue, the thoracic in purple, and the lumbar in sort of orange, and then the coccygeal and the sacral indicated below that. You can really see on the posterior portion of the hips in the gluteal region and in the lower limbs are served primarily by those nerve clusters. Now, when we look at spinal nerves, they're going to have what we call rami. These innervate deep muscles of the trunk and are responsible for movements of the vertebral column and the connective tissue and skin near the midline of the back. Um, Essentially, when we're talking about the rami, what we're talking about is branching off from a nerve cluster. Okay, so the dorsal ramus is going to branch off the nerve cluster that exits the spinal cord and wrap around to the back, while the ventral ramus is going to innervate various structures depending on which part of the spinal cord we're looking at. The thoracic region is going to form intercostal nerves that innervate the intercostal muscles and the skin over the thorax. The intercostal muscles, as you know, are between the ribs and they assist in breathing. The remaining spinal nerve have ventral rami that form 5 plexuses. Plexus is essentially a fancy word for a nerve net. The ventral rami of C1 through C4 form the cervical plexus. Those from C5 to T1 form the brachial plexus. L1 to L4 the lumbar, and L4 to S4 the sacral, and then finally S4 to S5 the coccygeal plexus. Um, Again, knowing your body map will help you locate where these nerve nets are. The cervical plexus near the neck, the brachial plexus serving the region of the arm, the lumbar plexus, the lower back, the sacral plexus above the gluteal region and below the lumbar region, and the coccygeal plexus, of course, um, the most inferior plexus in the nervous system, serving mostly the lower hips and lower limbs. Communicating rami communicate with the sympathetic chain ganglia that lie on either side of the vertebra. We call them paravertebral ganglia, and they can also communicate with intramural ganglia, which are located further away from the spinal cord and brain, and are generally the purview of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. These paravertebral ganglia, as we're going to find out, are primarily structures um, that deal with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and the relaying of messages to and from the central nervous system via these clusters of nerve cell bodies that lie outside the spinal cord. So you can see here the organization of these spinal nerves, the branching of these spinal nerves. You can see this is the ventral aspect of the spinal cord, the dorsal aspect back here. You can see the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus, and you can see the paravertebral ganglia. Uh, you've got one on each side of the spinal cord, and again, this is where a lot of information that is part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is relayed to and from different regions of the body. So if we look at the cervical plexus that's in the neck, C1 through C4 innervate superficial neck structures as well as the skin of the neck and the posterior portion of the head. The ansa cervicalis is a loop between C1 and C3. The phrenic nerve is innervated by nerve roots from C3 through C5 that are part of the cervical and the brachial plexus. And they're important because they innervate the diaphragm. And there's a mnemonic you can use to remember this. C345, keep the diaphragm alive. Basically, if you were to cut or damage any of these nerve roots between C3 and C5, then the phrenic nerve wouldn't be able to operate. The patient wouldn't be able to breathe, and you could kill them. Other nerves in the brachial plexus innervate muscles acting on the scapula and the arm, such as the pectoral muscles, the long thoracic, the thoracodorsal, the subscapular, and the suprascapular nerves. So if you think about where these are located, again, the name is going to tell you a lot about where the nerve is running. Pectoral nerve, innervating, among other things, the pectoralis major and minor, is going to run near the chest, the upper chest. The long thoracic, of course, is going to run vertically through the chest. The thoracodorsal is going to run towards the posterior aspect of the thoracic region. The subscapular nerve is going to run under the scapula, and the suprascapular nerve is going to run above it. So again, if you know your terminology, you can have a good idea about where these nerves are located. They innervate the skin of the medial arm and forearm. Um, Other plexuses include the lumbar and sacral plexuses. The lumbar plexus contains the ventral rami that run from lumbar 1 through 4. The sacral plexus has ventral rami that run from L4 to S4, and they're considered together because of their relatively close anatomical relationship. There are four major nerves that exit and enter the lower limb, and they include the obturator nerve, the femoral nerve, the tibial nerve, and the common fibular nerve. Now, if you want to wonder, where these nerves are located, if you think about it, again, the names will tell you a lot. The obturator nerve is going to run near the obturator foramen, which is in the anterior aspect of the os coxae. The femoral nerve is going to run near the femur. The tibial nerve near the tibia, and the common fibular nerve obviously is going to run near the fibula. The tibial and common fibular nerves are important. These two nerves together are referred to as the sciatic nerve, and it's one of the thickest nerves in the body, and as a result is often impinged. This condition is known as sciatica, and what we find in individuals that have pressure on this nerve is that we have problems with numbness and tingling and motor control in the lower limbs. Other lumbosacral plexi nerves are those that innervate the skin of the suprapubic area, the external genitalia, the superior medial thigh, and the posterior thigh. And these include the gluteal nerves, the pudendal nerves, the iliohypogastric nerve, the ilioingual nerve, and the genitofemoral, and then finally the cutaneous femoral. And again, you can get a pretty basic idea where these nerves run if you pick the names apart. The gluteal nerve obviously going to run near the buttock. The pudendal nerve is going to run essentially near the genitalia. The iliohypogastric nerve, again, break the name apart, it's going to run between the ilium and above the gastric region, which is near the stomach. The ilioingual nerve, the inguinal region is the groin. Okay, so this is going to run between the ilium and the groin. The genitofemoral is going to run between the genital area and the upper leg, the femur, and the cutaneous femoral is going to run near the femur. Okay, so the names can again give you an idea of the location of the different nerves. S5 is the coccygeal nerve, and it innervates muscles of the pelvic floor, and it also brings sensory information from the skin over the coccyx back to the central nervous system. Okay, that brings to an end this chapter. We'll be moving on to discover a little bit more about the nervous system in our next podcast. Again, be sure to review this information as it will be covered on a PRS quiz or upcoming exam. I'll see everybody in class. Thank you.